At-Taftazani suggests three objections to the Urmawi Samarkandi proposal. The first is that of scope, as many inquiries, not insofar as contingent beings, are dependent on God. The answer to this first objection is, first of all, it is that the task of having these inquiries, insofar as they relate to contingent beings that are dependent on God, is a digression with the aim of perfecting a craft, namely in this case Kalam theology. The second is that it is in order to report the views of the opponents in order to refute them. The third is that they are considered as principles. And the fourth is that if it does indeed become more than that, meaning it is more than fundamental principles that are required in this science, then it simply becomes idle talk. And it is quite common of latter theologians to mix natural philosophy and maths with Kalam theology. If At-Taftazani meant these questions were added after the engagement with the philosophers, then this is quite clearly false. And on the question of if Kalam is subordinated to a non-Islamic science, there is a quote from Taftazani here that it is not necessary for the principles of a Shari, a legalistic or Islamic science, to be demonstrated in a higher science, nor is it necessary that they are demonstrated in a Shari, Islamic science at all, for the science of legal principles takes principles from the Arabic sciences, in which some of its principles are demonstrated. One may also argue that the principles are thus evident in and of themselves, and this avoids some issue with Urmawi's original proposal, and which asserts a more restricted understanding of Kalam. Jurjani comes along and he begins his sort of discussion of knowledge and of sciences by saying that man seeks to perfect theoretical and practical faculties via the pursuit of knowledge. There is an infinite multiplicity of reality, which makes any attempt to grasp it unlikely to succeed. Thus, man requires a principled way of dividing up reality, and thus there are respective inquiries to make this task feasible. It's quite clear that Al-Jurjani has the development of the Islamic sciences in mind, meaning the trajectory of these sciences and the way that they've developed as part of this Islamic tradition over hundreds of years. The sciences in themselves are ultimately crafts. They're produced by humans and they reflect human interests. Thus, the purpose and intent of Ilmul Kalam, of rational Islamic theology, if it is used by theologians to prove their Islamic creed, if this is considered by Muslim theologians to be the highest science, and it is used to prove Islamic creed on a fundamental basis, then it is problematic to subordinate it to a non-Islamic science. At-Taftazani thus would say that Kalam theology is theology proper. It is a universal approach and thus may also be said to be an overextension of Kalam theology. Al-Jurjani, on the other hand, says that there is a philosophical imperative in Islam, and this is independent of any non-Islamic philosophy. Thus, Kalam theology is the authentic paradigm for Islamic philosophy, and secondly, it must offer a sufficiently comprehensive philosophy. There's an issue that arises here with the rule of Islam qualification that is used. The rule of Islam qualification, when it is used by Islamic theologians, fundamentally operates under the assumption that the rule of Islam entails or is what is true, and this would exclude other Kalami schools. Especially if operated under an orthodox Sunni perspective, this would exclude the other schools of Kalam theology such as the Mu'tazila. But this is clearly false because kalam is simply an intellectual tool that is used by individuals to rationally prove their theology, regardless of if this is orthodox creed that they're trying to prove or heterodox creed. We also see how this plays out with regards to Avicennian philosophy and Kalam theology. It may be that several beneficial theses of Avicennian philosophy may be incorporated into Kalam theology. However, it may also be argued that this is too conciliatory with the system of thought that is antithetical to the Islamic framework and Islamic sort of paradigm. And thus, it might end up risking making Kalam theology dependent on a non-Islamic science, and this would necessitate that Kalam theology is always one step behind of philosophy. Now in comes Jalal ad-Din Al-Dawani, who passed away in the year 908 of the Islamic calendar and or 1502 of the Gregorian calendar, after At-Taftazani and Al-Jurjani. Al-Dawani has multiple glosses on the Tajreed. He has a commentary on the Tahdhib, Al-Mantiq, and he has many old and new treatises on the existence of God. And he's a very influential philosopher in the later Islamic period. He raises objections such as how they have been mentioned on the qualification rule of Islam, because this doesn't apply to reality, because Kalam can be used to prove what may be viewed as orthodox creed and heterodox creed. But this is the point where he makes a very important intellectual breakthrough, and a very important distinction and nuance is brought to the discussion finally with Al-Dawani. He disentangles the various historical traditions of metaphysics from normative conceptions of it. He thus discovers that metaphysics is simply another branch of philosophy, and this branch of philosophy is a sub-science or discipline in and of itself, not specific to any particular approach, whether it be an Avicennian approach, a Greek approach, or a Ash'ari approach. Past attempts to, solve the demarcation problem were falsely based on the premise that Kalam and Falsafa, that Kalam theology and this kind of philosophy are two distinct sciences which require distinct subject matters. Hence why this need was felt to qualify the subject matter. However, Al-Dawani in his Sharh Dibajat Al-Tawali' mentioned something very important, and I quote from him: "There is no objection against Kalam and divine science being a single science in this sense," meaning they are operating within a single science, sharing the same subject matter. They simply disagree in approach within the same subject matter. They are more akin to research programs within. Thus, they're more akin to research programs operating within the same science, like, let's say, just like within the science of Islamic jurisprudence, we have the school of Ash-Shafi'i and the school of Abu Hanifa. They are simply two different approaches within the same science, and the same applies here when it comes to Avicennian metaphysics and Kalam theology. Kalam is just one more approach to this kind of general metaphysics, and the same is said for Avicennian metaphysics. The science is the same, which is the study of being qua being. It would appear that no one has arrived at this before me, said Al-Dawani. And Al-Dawani was true in this, and Al-Dawani produced an incredible intellectual and philosophical breakthrough via this. Thus, the science of this kind of general metaphysics includes both Kalam and Falsafa, but also the philosophy of As-Suhrawardi and the Neoplatonized mysticism of Ibn Arabi and more. The disagreement in principles and approaches is not in terms of the subject matter. In summary then, Al-Dawani fundamentally liquidated or dissolved this whole issue by simply pointing out that these two are just research programs within the same science. It would thus seem that the Mutakallimun did in fact make very important intellectual breakthroughs throughout the classical and modern periods, contrary to what many Orientalists and many contemporary academics may argue today. In fact, posterity has vindicted the mutakallimun, the theologians, on most issues in comparison with the ancient Greek philosophers. For example, when we see or imagine something, is it literally an image of that object imprinted out in our brain? No, as the mutakallimun said. Is the moon a simple, eternal, perfect sphere? No, as the mutakallimun said. Did the sun exist eternally, impossible for other suns to exist? No, as the mutakallimun said. Are visible bodies continuous, stable, as they appeared to the naked eye? No, as the mutakallimun said. Thus, they have quite clearly been vindicted and absolved from the accusations of those who accuse them of intellectual and philosophical stagnation. In comparison to their counterparts who engaged in Greek philosophy, more so than the mutakallimun did. In fact, Mustafa Sabri Effendi, who was one of the great scholars of the last century of the Islamic rational sciences, said that it was around the time some mutakallimun were convinced of certain philosophical falsafa theories that they suffered serious intellectual decline and stagnation. Thus, the Kalam philosophical project is perhaps more interesting than the Aristotelian and Neoplatonic project of their contemporaries, and much more research has to be done into the genius of many of these great thinkers of the Islamic theological and philosophical tradition.